Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Leon Tabak. I will moderate our discussion today. Our topic is the future of courtship. And for this I have three guests to help us explore the topic. The first is Miriam Timmer-Hackert. Do you want to say a few words about yourself, to introduce yourself to the audience?
I went to law school and worked as a lawyer, and then had a couple kids and went back and worked as a domestic violence advocate and a sexual assault advocate at Waypoint, and then realized that I really should go back to law if I wanted to help in that area, that legally was a good way to do that. Right now I'm mediating a lot of divorces. Okay. And then I have a 12-year-old daughter, and an 8-year-old son, so this is kind of personal as well.
There's your concern. Okay.
Yeah.
And Brett Dupree is a teacher in our community. Do you want to say a few more words about yourself and your interest in our topic here?
Sure. I am a father of 6, and my oldest is 12, youngest is 1. Oldest is 14, youngest is 1. I skipped 1. And I teach in the Limar School District. I'm a band director there. Taught both middle school and high school in the area locally, and in my faith I help youth and youth leaders kind of in the northeast area of Iowa. So.
And Viviana Guajardo is a student at Cornell College, where I also teach, so I know Viviana coming here. Do you want to say a few words to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. I'm a sociology anthropology major from San Antonio, Texas. And today's topic I think is particularly interesting because I guess coming from the younger generation, it's really great to reflect on these sort of things. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, the starting point for our discussion comes from some newspaper articles that I had encountered. And these articles provided accounts from young women who were disappointed with young men. Sorry, Brett. And one of these accounts told of a young woman who had been invited on what she thought was a date, and the day came, and she was waiting for this fellow, and nothing happened, and the clock turned 10 o'clock, and she got a phone call, and he said, "Well, I'm going out with the guys. Do you want to tag along?" And this was not her expectation of a date. She thought a date meant something one-on-one, an opportunity for two people to get to know one another. The word date suggested a mutual romantic interest. Hanging out with the guys was not her understanding of what this should be. So I begin by asking you, have you heard stories like this yourself among the young people you work with, among your classmates, your students, perhaps your children's friends, or maybe some of us might be young enough to remember this. Has this resonated at all when you hear your classmates at Cornell College?
A really common thing I hear is the confusion between, is this a date or am I just hanging out with a person? There's kind of this sort of gray area, is are we labeling this a date? Are we really going to get this one-on-one attention to get to know each other? Or is it just, oh, we're going to watch the game or play video games in your dorm room with your other friends? And I think there can be the lack of, clearly, this is what we are going to do, that really important communication that can lead to those sorts of stories.
Miriam, you have anything to add?
I imagine that as lesbians and gays get more common, that's going to be even more of an issue, because it's not necessarily anytime I'm with somebody of the opposite sex it's a date, and that must be really awkward. Yeah. I imagine now that people have to clarify, even with people of the same gender, I just want to be friends. I'm not. Not that there's anything wrong with it, as they always say. Not that there's anything wrong with being a lesbian, but I'm not one.
Yeah, I in talking to some of the students that I teach, both, especially at the high school level, I was asking them, so there are two of them that are dating per se, or boyfriend and girlfriend, right. and And I asked them, so how did that come to be? And they said, well, we started by, there seems to be kind of 3 stages, at least for the 16 to 18-year-old crowd. And tell me if this is different for you, but they start by, we're talking is kind of the first thing, and that includes like just talking to each other at school or texting or whatever. And then they say, well, we're hanging out. And hanging out could mean anything from just being with big group together, or it could also mean being together, but there's technically no commitment quite yet.
Right.
And then at some point after hanging out for so long, then someone would say, oh, do you want to date me now? And that means at that point, okay, that with their boyfriend and girlfriend, or they're committed. The interesting thing that when I was discussing it with them was I asked, so during the hanging out time, is it okay for you to hang out with someone else also during that time, if you're just hanging out? And they're both the boy and the girl said, no, it's not okay, which was interesting because it feels to me like once you decide that you want to hang out with someone, that you've kind of already feel that they're already taken that step, towards commitment in some way early on. But
So I think it's a common passage for many young adults to be anxious about prospects for love and for marriage potentially. But I was driving with some of my students and heard from the back seat, the students talking with one another. And again, this was a case of a female student, but expressing great anxiety that she thought, I will never find a special person. And there was some, at least I had this impression that I thought, and I think the students thought, that things had changed, that it was tougher now than it was in the past. I met another young woman at a workshop recently who has several sisters, and she spoke about conversations with her mother. And again, this sense that things have gotten not only different, but harder. Is there any shared understanding that the world has gotten tougher for this particular romantic pursuits?
I think one issue is that we talk about domestic violence and we talk about sexual assault a lot more. And so I think instead of just all pretending it doesn't happen, admitting it happens means that we all have this anxiety. What if it happens to me, or what if it happens to my kids? And part of the confusion is that we hear of so many women being sexually assaulted, and you're like, well, if 1 in 3 women in college gets assaulted, does that mean 1 in 3 men in college is out there assaulting people? Like, does my daughter have only a 2/3 chance of getting a decent guy? And that's not actually true at all, because it's the same men, the same small percentage of men who repeatedly assault lots of people. So that's a slightly comforting fact. But then it's like, well, how do you avoid that really nasty guy when you can't tell? When obviously he's not going to tell you before he invites you out for a date that he doesn't care what you say, he's going to do whatever he wants. So
I think there was a time, and I don't know when, a long time ago, that there was, in regards to dating and then courting and so forth, there was a clear target and a clear perspective that people could aim at. And it was, I graduate from high school, I go to college or vocational school, and then I'm looking to find a spouse and start a family. And so that dating and courtship was leading towards that starting a family as kind of the basic unit of society. And I think over time, as a large portion of our culture has that family, the importance of family has eroded in our society, that target has gone away. And if that target has gone away, then the purpose of dating and the purpose of courtship for many of our youth it becomes you shoot the arrow, and instead of shooting the arrow at the target, you just shoot the arrow up on the wall, and then you go paint the target around all your arrows and say, hey, everything's fine, But there's no target to hit if that idea of family, and that's what I'm leading towards, has kind of gone away.
So I spoke with one of your classmates, Viviana. Again, we were in a group gathering, and this is related to my work in helping students find careers, as it happens. And we went around the room and asked people what their postgraduate plans were, what kind of careers they were planning. And I was surprised greatly that one of your male classmates announced that finding a wife and starting a family was his first priority. I was surprised not only that he had listed this goal for himself, but that he had the courage to speak this in front of his peers at our college. That struck me as very unusual, that a young man would say that.
I'm really happy that you mentioned that. I think there's a lot to be said about the workforce and how we as young people are going into the workforce and what this means for us, how we prioritize our time and our goals. So do we say, yeah, I really want to go into this Bumble app or this Tinder app and put all my energy and resources into meeting a person, whether it be casually, hookup style, or the chance of that one person, or do I want to, really work on a startup? Those are really common these days. Kickstarters, making your own app companies, and a lot of young people are really excited about this, what we can do with technology in regards to our own futures. So I think how we are operating in our lives and prioritizing what we think of our needs as millennials, how are we going to pay off our student loans, for example? All these factors that we're kind of turning over in our minds. Sometimes the casual hookup in our life seems to be an option rather than that very much sought after the one. So I guess we kind of take it for the moment, sometimes in our social lives, but also we think long term, how will I, be making money for myself as well.
Do your classmates, your peers, are they using the internet to find romantic partners? Now I know for young adults a little older, this has become a common means to search for marriage partners. But are students as young as you doing this too?
Wow, the apps. I think Tinder and Bumble. Bumble is a newer one that it kind of it's been described as an elevated version of Tinder because it's supposed to give the woman more power, so to speak, in that once there is a match, so the guy says yes, the woman says yes when they're swiping through. The woman, if there is a match, the woman has 24 hours to make the first move, and only she can make the first move. The guy cannot make the first move, that's how it differs from Tinder. And I think apps like that are really changing the scheme of how even gender roles are working and how easy it is just to swipe yes, no, let me shoot a quick message to so-and-so who I was matched with. So yeah, app dating is, I think, really huge amongst the younger generation.
My goodness, what do you know about this, the way technology has changed the way we
Are people honest on those apps, do you think?
No.
Okay, that's what I was wondering. It seems like it would be so easy to lie.
It's so easy. Putting your best self, like the best version of your identity forward, whether it was a picture, your job description, your age, your interests, what kind of photo you're putting. Are you the adventurous type of individual? Are you the more seductive type of individual? What you're projecting to get that yes when you're being swiped through.
I have two colleagues that I work with that both met their spouses on an online dating service, and they talked about, when I asked them about it, they talked about how it really sometimes took that online portion took the place of the first date, and that sometimes there weren't all those extra questions about getting to know the person and so forth. It was, you kind of already knew that information, even if it was just Facebook stalking them. There was a lot of information that you could gather about them. So I certainly think technology's changed things dramatically in terms of how you make that initial.
So as I said, in preparation for this discussion, I read a number of articles, and some of the people who responded to the claim that dating is dead said, well, it ought to be dead because we can accomplish some of the purposes of dating in other ways. And dating used to be a way to get to know somebody, and now you can scope out this person ahead of time, and maybe you don't need the same formalism to begin to know who that person is. So I'm going to ask you a question that I asked another one of my students. So I'm the oldest one here, right? And when I was a teenager, an adolescent, a young man, living with my parents, there was one phone in the house. That phone was at the hallway between the kitchen and the living room. If I wanted to call a special friend, My parents and my siblings were part of that conversation. They were in earshot, right? And there was no texting, there was no email, so I didn't have that sideways way of reaching somebody. You know, if I didn't have the courage to speak, I could send a text message instead and hope for the best there. So I asked one of my students, I said, "You're on these phones all the time. You carry a phone with you. You're in constant contact. It must be much easier for you." And the student said, "No, it's as terrifying as ever to open up communication with somebody else." What is your take on that? Do you think it's made it easier, harder? Or?
I think I would feel a little bit more at ease being able to do that first approach on your phone, and if you get slapped down, you can have your girlfriend right there to debrief afterward. But
Okay.
I've talked to a lot of the youth and asked them that question. Is it okay for a guy or a girl to ask someone out on a date via text? And I was surprised because I expected the answer to be yes. And most of the youth that I talked to, either inside my faith or at my school, said, no, that's something that he should do either in person or by phone. I know it happens, but I was surprised that especially a lot of the girls said, no, I prefer that I actually hear his voice.
And you're not supposed to break up with someone via text.
Certainly not.
That's rude.
Yeah.
Or ask, can we date now, and like take it to the next level. That's not supposed to happen that way either. So, but I certainly think that texting makes it possible. I remember when I was dating, when I was young, that I would leave at the end of my date and just be heartbroken that I wasn't going to see her again for another 12 hours, you know. And I think nowadays those youth are constantly in contact anyway. I mean, they go to bed and it's text. So it certainly changes the way that parents need to kind of oversee that and so forth.
Part of the criticism that again comes from young women especially is that but myself in this group, many of us live in a kind of extended adolescence. This is part of the problem. This is a topic that you also raised, that you used to have these benchmarks. There was a place where you were a child, and you were an adolescent, and you were a student, and you were a worker, and you were married, but now we have people who are far past the age of 21, who are still trying to act like they're 21, and there isn't this same sense of progression through life. Part of it is also that it takes us longer to settle into a career and establish ourselves. So the age at which people marry is much later than it was in the past, and people are also starting careers later. They leave school and they try something and they try something else, and maybe they go back to school for something. And so maybe in a previous generation, an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old who was dating was thinking about, you know, in 2 years I'm going to be on my own out in the world and I want a partner during that time. And now we're thinking I'm going to be independent for a longer time, finding my way for a longer time. And dating doesn't have that same place in life. You think young people are stuck in adolescence? Is that part of our problem here? The girls are complaining about boys who are down in the basement with their video games, and they have no idea what romance might mean to a young lady. They're just playing the video games.
I think it's got to be a little harder when instead of working 9 to 5, so many people are graduate students until they're 26, that they haven't really held down a full-time job. You know, a lot of people work part-time in college, but it's you know, just a job to get you your bills paid, and it's not that whole I'm an adult now, because you're still a graduate student. And I think that's really hard. That's adding another 4 or 5 years to a lot of people's kind of adolescence.
Yeah, I would go back again and say, I think we talked about, Viviana talked about priorities and so forth, and I think the priority for young people of starting a family and in our society has lessened. That is maybe not as important as first establishing a career or whatever else, or maybe just having fun right now, you know. And so even though I read a recent Pew research that stated in 2016 that if those people who are members of a family and mom and dad and kids are much more likely to be well off. The kids are much more likely to be well off and so forth, both socially and economically and so forth. And so even though the studies show that starting a family is the best way to be economically secure, that for whatever reason that family desire, setting that as a priority is lessened.
So Viviana, Miriam suggested one kind of concern or advice that parents might have, and that's the safety of young people who are going out pairing up, and they're and the girl is with a boy alone, and worry about safety. But there are other concerns a parent might have, and there's other kinds of advice a parent might have. Is there any advice you've heard, wish you had heard, that you know friends have heard from parents? What kind of guidance are young people getting as they go out and pursue their romantic lives?
Right. So as a young girl, well, first of all, the internet has certainly evolved. And as a young lady, I was told, be careful who you chat with on the internet. Whether it's one of those like recreational, like Dungeons and Dragon type websites, you know, gameplay, you can do chats on there. Anything from that level to email. My mom would always just warn me. But given that the internet has changed, and the way we communicate, the avenues we can communicate through, it has evolved. My landlord, her coworker at school was on the computer, and one of those ads popped up, and she clicked the X to get out of it. And upon clicking the X, pornography popped up. And this is at a school, an elementary school. So if we're talking about online safety, there's so many different ways for your computer and the person, be it a young individual looking at it, to be bombarded with these images that are not really appropriate for a young person to be looking at. And even pressing X can activate a chat or your webcam to be looked through by someone else. All these types of things, cybersecurity can be really in question. So given that technology has evolved, our internet safety as adults, but as young adults, really is something to be mindful of course.
Well, I come from a family of 3 brothers. My wife comes from a family of 3 sisters. So when we met, there was a bit of challenge to learn how to talk to one another. We had grown up in a world where boys talked with boys and girls talked with girls, and we discovered that sometimes boys and girls have different interests and different ways of talking with one another. And so I think that's part of the kind of advice you might give a young person, is just how to be comfortable with a person of the opposite sex. And again, the boys have to learn that their prospective girlfriend might not want to play this video game, or she might, but maybe she has other interests too. So if you got any advice like that on just how to be comfortable, how to get along, how to hold a conversation with a newly met friend, and so on.
Right. So in my faith, there are some guidelines that we teach our youth, and some of those are things like don't start dating until you're 16. After that, try and don't let it become a steady dating situation, because you're not really looking to get married yet. And then when it's time to start looking to court, then it's time for you to start kind of focusing on one and not just hang out, you know, for the rest of your 20s or whatever. And I have asked a lot of the youth that I teach at the high school level and others that are not of my faith. So I asked them, do you go to church? Yes or no? And then I would ask them, well, did your parents ever teach anything about dating, or did they give you some guidelines and so forth? And I was floored that a lot of these youth, 16, 17, 18 years old, say, no, my parents never really talked about it. Almost every single one, there was not a lot of guidance given. All of them said, I have a curfew, you know, I have to be home by a certain time. But there wasn't a lot of guidance in terms of this is how you should act on a date, or this is when it's okay to start kind of dating for you, and so forth. A lot of that seems to have been left up to whatever the media tells us, or whatever your friends are telling you. And that's what a lot of them said is, you know, I've learned most of how to date just from whatever my friends do, you know.
Anything to add?
My poor children, especially when I was working as a sexual assault and domestic violence advocate, it was very hard for me to come home from work and not talk about things that aren't necessarily age appropriate, but I always did try to let them know the basics, and that's that, you know, it isn't necessarily stranger danger. It doesn't, just because you know someone doesn't mean you're necessarily safe from them, because, you know, most statistically you're less safe with people that you know. You know, it's not going to be somebody jumping out from behind the bushes. It'll be somebody that you're hanging out with at your friend's house that you need to be worried about. But just as a mediator, I just always want to encourage people to say what's on your mind and don't expect the other person to read it, because talking works so much better than mind reading. You know, don't assume that you know how they're feeling, and don't assume that you know that they know what you want.
Okay.
We're always amazed as mediators how much of this stuff just comes out when we ask a pointed question, a specific question, and they answer it and realize that they had agreed. They just hadn't managed to communicate that to each other.
So it took me a long time to learn. I think I picked up a lot of my expectations of romance from television programs and movies. And in those television programs, the teenagers were having dates every week, you know, and it took me a long time to learn, but this is not the case. And there are a great many very attractive people, attractive in every way. They're interesting, they're handsome and pretty, who don't have much dating experience, who go through high school and college without a partner, and that's fine. So I want to ask you about, you know, a favorite movie or television show that kind of gave you a picture of what romance might be. We're very near the end of our conversation. Is there anything you can think of there? Maybe, maybe not? So yeah, go ahead.
I'll throw one out. So
Yeah.
for me, I think, although I despise the novels themselves, because I think
Yeah.
they're way too flowery, there's some of the Jane Austen movies
Okay.
and so forth. I think very classic and very, the men are true to what they should be, and the men are men, and act like gentlemen and so forth. That was great for me.
Maybe we can have a short answer, yes or no. Is television and movies, is that where people are trying to learn how to do this? Do you think so?
I would definitely say
I think
yes.
it's an influence, yeah.
Unfortunately, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hopefully also from their families, I don't know, that's what I would hope, that my kids would go to their aunts and uncles who've all done a good job of making a relationship work and prioritizing their families.
So I saw a commercial for a fragrance, a fragrance for men, as it happens. And the punchline of the commercial was, don't rely on fate. You see this character passing through time. He starts out in the Ice Age, and then ancient Rome, and then the Wild West. And each time, in each reincarnation, he encounters the same woman. And then finally they get together. And the punchline, as I say, is use our product, don't rely on fate. So maybe that's the message for us today, is there's someone out there waiting, and there are ways to pursue this constructively and safely. And love awaits us all here as we approach Valentine's Day. Okay. So I think I've got just enough time. If there's one last thing people want to say, anybody want to add something else to our conversation there? Love at first
Yes.
sight? Don't rely on fate?
Oh, not necessarily. And it's okay if a relationship that you thought was perfect at one point ends up not being perfect. It's okay to say, I made a mistake, this guy wasn't as good as I thought he was, and I'm going to say goodbye now. That's just fine. You're not ruined for life because you didn't make one relationship work. Even if you got married, it's okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Viviana and Brett and Miriam. And thank you for joining us on Ethical Perspectives on the News. And happy Valentine's Day, and I hope there's lots of love in your life too. Thank you very much.